I'm Dr. DeAun Nelson, and I invite medical professionals to listen as I discuss how shifting the focus off of weight in healthcare can greatly improve health outcomes for patients of all sizes. I will explore what it means to practice in a weight-inclusive paradigm and discuss tools to implement these ideas in practice. Keep in mind that the information I will present may be new to many of my listeners and may sound radical to some, but stick with me. This information could change the lives of your patients. Today's episode is all about why diets, and by diets we mean intentional weight loss, ultimately do not result in long-term significant weight loss or improved health. Today I'm joined by a guest host, Sumner Brooks. She's a registered dietitian here in Portland, and I'm going to let her tell you a little bit about herself. Welcome to the podcast, Sumner.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be here with you.
Yay.
A little bit about me is I've been an RD for coming up on 10 years, and I have been doing work focused around eating disorder treatment and prevention for about the last 8 years. I specialize a lot in binge eating disorder, and I'm an intuitive eating counselor as well. Well, I was trained very traditionally, so I did a dietetic internship at the VA in Los Angeles, and I have my master's in public health from UCLA. And actually, my first couple years practicing as a dietitian was mostly outpatient counseling. And it really is that experience of hearing what people's experiences have been and starting to work with people who want to change things about their health that has shaped my whole approach and my whole belief about how do we help people with their health and well-being. And, the eating disorder prevention and treatment and working from a health at every size approach is very different, of course, than what you hear most often, but I really will say it's been my own lived experiences with disordered eating and the experiences of all of the people that I have worked with that have brought me here.
That's amazing. So excited to have you here, not have disordered eating in the world. In the episodes on weight stigma and weight bias, the last couple episodes, we talked about how the pressure to lose weight and the recommendation by doctors to lose weight is harmful to people. I actually suggest listening to those if you haven't already done so. It'll give you a lot of information that we're not really going to cover in detail in this episode. All you need to do to understand the profound negative effect that dieting and the medical recommendation to diet has on a person is to sit down with them face to face behind closed doors and talk. If you've ever done this with anybody who's been repeatedly shamed at the doctor's office for needing to lose weight or bothered by family members or friends to lose weight, you will immediately see and feel their pain and suffering. I know I've experienced this a lot with my patients. And you won't be able to ignore the impact that external pressure to lose weight has had on their relationships with their own bodies, how that broken relationship is hurting their health and self-care. The shame itself, as we talked about in the previous episode, is negatively affecting that person's health. And it's something that is not well studied or accounted for within the evidence that supports dieting and weight loss for health. This is weight-biased fat-phobic research, and it is a problem.
So, I think it's really important in this conversation as we look at this topic of why diets don't work, to start off by talking about what is this definition of work?
Absolutely.
So we're all on the same page. So we could have a definition of work to mean improving someone's health no matter what their weight is. And if that's where we're going with the word work, then how are we measuring someone's health? And do we have an agreement that health doesn't look the same for everyone? Really important concept there. On the other hand, our definition of work could be that a person loses weight or loses weight quickly. So with that, we're not looking at all on what's short-term, what's long-term, what are the lasting effects, what's the consequence. We're just looking at, does this diet create weight loss for someone? We know that we live in a world that socially and culturally has a definition of work is that the diet makes someone thin. That's an assumption that I think we hear it everywhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for today's purposes, let's assume that the medical field wants a definition of work to be improving health for the long term, and that health is broadly defined and differs based on the individual. Does that sound good?
That sounds great. What I wanted to talk about next, so we've got this definition of what working is. I would like to go back to physiology and kind of talk a little bit about some studies that have been done in the past that are showing why diets aren't working as far as long-term weight loss, and how that weight loss or even attempts at weight gain have negatively affected people's health. There are studies in the past that have shown that purposefully changing people's weight permanently is not as easy as eating more or less. So that's the calories in, calories out fallacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
People make this assumption that if you eat X amount of calories, if they're less than what you burn, then you will lose weight. If it's more, then you will gain weight. And to an extent, that is true, but there's a lot more that goes into it. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's not as easy as just eating more or less. Also, attempts to change weight can affect people in negative ways that are physiologically problematic, but also psychologically problematic. And our bodies are really good at keeping within a fairly narrow range of weight, and will do all that they can to stay in that narrow range as much as possible. And generally, this has kept us alive, right? Historically.
Right.
So it's actually a really good thing for our bodies to be able to do. One of the more interesting, very early studies that was done actually on starvation was done in the mid-1940s. Ancel Keys did a study. The goal of the study was to find out what it took to rehabilitate people who have been starving. And this was a big problem in Europe, especially after the war, because there were a lot of people that were starving during the war and after. And so he wanted to figure out what is the best way to refeed those people to get them healthy again and have them, get back to normal weight, because a lot of them were starving. So he had a group of 36 conscientious objectors. So these are guys that would have been in the military, but for whatever reason did not want to fight, but they wanted to serve their country. And so they had joined the civilian public service. He had them sequestered in a football stadium, actually underneath a football stadium at the University of Minnesota. And he did this project over a little less than a year. So the first phase of the project, he actually had them eating about 3,200 calories a day. I am going to talk about calories and weight, and we are going to bring up numbers. So if that's problematic for anybody listening, please be aware that that's going to happen. For the studies, we kind of have to, and I'm not going to bleep it out. So please be aware of that. They were eating about 3,200 calories a day. Most of them were fairly fit. All of them were thin. He did a lot of tests to gather information about heart size and blood volume and their fitness levels, body fat levels. So he was pretty busy. And then they were ordered to maintain an active lifestyle. So they kept working, and they were ordered to walk 22 miles a week. So it's about 3 miles a day. That's pretty average.
So sort of average intake.
Yeah.
Adult male intake and average activity.
Yeah.
Basically.
And actually a little bit above average adult intake, because he wanted to make sure that they weren't already starving. Because that would ruin his experiment. For 6 months, the phase 2 was the semi-starvation period. During that time, their food intake was cut to 1,570 calories a day, and the food was very carefully controlled. In fact, a couple of the guys were actually kicked out of the study because they kept sneaking away and eating elsewhere, and so they weren't able to continue. The food was, interestingly enough, very carbohydrate rich and protein poor, because it would simulate the food that people in Europe would have available to them. So it was a very specific diet. And then Keys had the men maintain their active lifestyle, so still walking and doing their jobs. And their jobs were in the lab, so they were monitored. After 6 months, they went through a controlled rehabilitation, and he initially subdivided them into 4 groups and had them each have different levels of calories. It was 400, 800, 1,200, and 1,600 more calories per day than they had in the starvation period. Ultimately, especially the ones who were having lower calories just weren't handling it well. So he ultimately just bumped up their food quite a bit and determined that around 4,000 calories a day were needed to recover. Although a lot of them did end up eating a lot more than that. Mm-hmm. And then after that, he let them go, but he kept a few of them back, and they stayed, and they were allowed unrestricted access to food, and they were generally consuming about 5,000 calories a day. Sometimes they would go up to 11,000 calories a day. So yeah, they ate a lot.
Yeah.
And when the weight that they did gain back was mostly fat. They did lose muscle tone. What was interesting is during the semi-starvation period, they had relatively quick decline in energy and strength. And they said that they felt old and tired, and they began to experience mental apathy. And they stopped thinking about things like political affairs and world events. And I mean, they're young men who, didn't go to war, so they were really involved in that sort of thing, but they didn't care about it anymore. Their sex drives declined, and they became obsessed with food. They would read cookbooks and look at pictures of food. And I just want to remind you, these are like 18 to 20 odd year old men in the 1940s, and they're looking for cookbooks. This is not generally normal behavior for these types of guys. And they would focus on food. It became the only thing they talked about. When they would eat very slowly and just try to enjoy their food as much as possible. They would get very irritable if their food was delayed. They were allowed unrestricted access to chewing gum, water, and black coffee. And they would often chew up to 40 packs of gum a day and drink up to 15 cups of coffee. And ultimately, they were actually limited on their gum because they were just eating so much gum.
And DeAun, how interesting is it to point out that they reported that the food tasted really delicious, even though they were purposely being served bland foods?
Oh, yeah.
Which just kind of shows you how intelligent and wise that your brain really is when you're not getting enough to eat.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Everybody's like, oh, this plain potato is the best ever.
Oh, it wants you to just eat everything you could.
Yeah. Yeah. So like I said before, a lot of them did cheat, and so they started having to be monitored 100% of the time. So they weren't allowed to go anywhere alone. One man was actually sent to a psychiatric ward a few weeks into the experiment because he threatened to kill Ancel Keys and kill himself. And interestingly enough, after eating normally for a few days, he was fine. So that was pretty intense. Ultimately, after the refeeding, after the experiment, they ended up about the same weight as they had started. And they had lost a significant amount of weight, most of them. They had physical changes that were pretty interesting. Their heart rate slowed, some going down to 35 beats per minute, which is so slow. That's frighteningly slow. Their bowel movements dropped to about 1 a week, and their blood volume dropped to 10%. And their hearts actually got smaller. Most of them have developed edema. They drink a lot of water, so they think that might have caused it, but it would happen in their ankles, knees, and their faces. The pictures, which I can put a couple on the website, they looked like concentration camp victims. They were so emaciated. That's after 6 months. They also were dizzy, had muscle soreness, reduced coordination. One side effect I read about is the whites of their eyes got really, really white because the vessels in their eyes would shrink, and people said it was really creepy looking. Like it was very odd. They were cold all the time, and as they lost weight, they found it difficult to sit for long periods of time because they just didn't have anything to cushion their bones. They did note that their hearing did improve. He actually noticed a change, particularly at lower frequencies, so there's that, I guess. And interestingly enough, they did not see themselves as being skinny. They thought everybody else just looked fat.
Interesting.
And I mean, you can see all their ribs. They had about 18 of the 19 surviving volunteers were interviewed in 2003, and so 60 years after the experiment. And they said that they were haunted about food for years. Like they would dream about it, and they were afraid people would take it away from them again. But most of them said that they would do it again because they really felt like it was something they did for their country and, to help other people. And it really did give us a lot of information, and it's certainly ethically not an experiment that could really happen today. We know a lot about starvation, unfortunately, because of it.
When you look at these physical changes and the negative consequences, And then just to pause for a minute and go back to the beginning of the starvation period, these diets were cut to 1,570 calories, 1,570 calories, which I think it's important to note is only just over 400 calories less than what's considered to be an average adult intake.
Yeah.
So, many people might not realize that 1,500 calories is often incredibly insufficient, if not putting someone into starvation mode.
Absolutely. And, if you look at a lot of people who are dieting, they're eating easily 11 or, 1,200 calories is a pretty average restrictive diet.
You hear it all the time.
If you're on the HCG diet, it's 500 calories a day.
500 calories a day. And these men were in a controlled environment. They could not go off their diet.
Right.
So, yes, they survived, but the damage had been done.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's, have a little bit of compassion for yourself, or if you know someone who's ever been through dieting, that maybe you're not supposed to stay on that diet. And maybe that's why you go off.
Absolutely. Our bodies want us to go off. Yeah. Our bodies do not want us to starve. They very much want to be alive. It's very important to them.
Very important.
Which I'm very proud. I'm very happy that my body wants to stay alive, because that really helps me stay alive, because I am my body.
Our bodies are designed to protect us from starvation. One of our most basic capabilities as humans.
Absolutely. Then I kind of wanted us to talk a little bit about The Biggest Loser, which is the Ancel Keys study of the 2000s. Again, volunteers who are intentionally going through a significant weight loss event, although they did start at higher weights than the volunteers did.
Driven by money, motivated by money to lose weight. But so essentially, The Biggest Loser study is looking at what are the outcomes after the show ended.
And the study, I think it happened in 2016 is when it came out.
Right. Okay. So what we observed in this group of people who started out at higher body weights, went through extreme exercise and low calorie eating for a number of weeks and months in order to lose the most weight, is that we see that the more weight that they lost, the more it slowed down their resting metabolism as a result. And so it's not hard to understand then that if someone's resting metabolism is lower, you're going to have to continue to decrease your food intake to adjust for this altered metabolism if you want to keep that weight off.
Right.
And so because a human is only going to eat so few calories, you're going to gain the weight back. You're just going to gain the weight back after that kind of restriction.
And it's been very interesting in subsequent studies to see how very energy efficient our bodies can get. So yeah, it's definitely something to think about. And I'm going to jump back just a second to the behaviors that the men in the starvation study had. If you think about people who are dieting on the regular, if they're struggling mentally, they're not probably, they might not be doing a good job at their work as parents, through their life. I'm not blaming them for this. I'm just saying that those of us, and there's a lot of us of all sizes who are restricting. And so you have to start thinking of that too. Like all of the behaviors that these men were showing.
These are eating disorder behaviors, that we could commonly see. Absolutely. That would be very, very predictable in anorexia nervosa or in bulimia nervosa with restricting, is that food just becomes the focus, and again, that is your body's doing its job to try to do everything it can to bring you back to food.
Right. And these are the behaviors that we use to diagnose eating disorders in people who are smaller, but we encourage and use as treatment plans for people who are larger.
Right.
And we will probably mention this again, and I would like you to hear that several times.
Yeah. And, this is never to shame anyone or to blame anyone, but how many times have you observed or maybe even congratulated someone for counting every calorie that passes their lips, using only cookbooks and recipes that tell them the calorie amounts, the macronutrient amounts. That's obsessive, heightened food eating behavior. That's not really natural and normal eating behavior to be thinking about every calorie on that level.
No.
So we might not recognize that as disordered culturally, but if you can kind of zoom out and take a step back and compare that to normal eating behavior, you can see, yeah, that's unusual, and that's directly in line with what we saw in the Ancel Keys study.
Absolutely. And I will say that I will be doing a show in the future specifically about eating disorders and disordered eating. So I'll definitely go into a lot more detail, and maybe Sumner will join me for that one.
There's lots to talk about.
There's always lots to talk about. Another experiment that I thought was interesting, I was looking for overfeeding experiments. You know, have we ever tried to get people to gain weight just for fun? And we have, actually. In the 1960s, Ethan Sims wanted to see what would happen if we had people gain weight. And he ultimately ended up doing the experiment at the Vermont State Prison because, again, they were a controllable group of people. The study lasted for 10 weeks, and the prisoners were supposed to gain 15 to 25% of their body weight, which is actually a lot. It's a lot of weight. It required that most of them eat 8,000 to 10,000 calories a day, more than they were used to. So that's like more than 3 times what was required to maintain their weight, just to gain that percentage. And then once the experiment was over and they went back to eating regularly and like how they had been eating before, their metabolisms actually sped up and they lost the weight that they had gained fairly rapidly. They didn't keep it on for very long either. So their body basically said, okay, we got it. Let's go back.
So their body said, that's not my set weight range. We're going to go ahead and take you back to where we're designed to be.
Exactly. And it is important that they did not stay that higher weight for very long, because very often when people stay at a higher weight for a long period of time, the body does tend to defend that weight, that higher weight. And then something that it occurred to me as I was writing all of this, the movie Super Size Me, which was done in 2004 by Morgan Spurlock, he decided to eat McDonald's only for 30 days. And I was thinking about this in light of the overeating studies. And in the beginning of the movie, he had a really hard time eating as much as he was supposed to. I mean, he was going from a fairly, I think mostly vegan diet. His girlfriend was vegan and she cooked a lot, but he was not technically vegan. But he went from that to eating McDonald's, and like the shift in the macronutrients that he was eating, but then also the amount that he was eating. So if they asked him to supersize it, he would. I remember one one scene where he actually is like vomiting out his car window because he can't eat. Like, it's too much. And that's part of his body just going, what are you doing? We don't need this. And he was not interested in eating. It was interesting to look at it from a very different point of view than I had in 2004 when I first saw it. Just something to keep in mind. And then something else to think about too, the size does matter when it comes to calories. So if you have a larger person, they're naturally going to need more calories just to stay alive than a smaller person. And so if you put somebody who has a larger body on the same calories as somebody who is smaller than them, would require that as automatically restrictive. And again, peeling back the layers a little bit on that. Okay, so it's restrictive. Like, many people will jump to the conclusion, well, they'll just lose weight. They'll burn fat to take care of that. Well, that's totally not what happens to a person's body. As we mentioned, previous studies showed their metabolism slows, and their thoughts about food are going to increase. Their desire to eat food is going to increase. The way food tastes is going to change to them. And again, as medical professionals, we have to think about, what does resting metabolic rate really mean? If we're not feeding someone enough to cover their metabolic rate and their energy needs, well, we're going to make an impact on lean tissue. And lean tissue is not just bicep muscle and quad muscle. Lean tissue is heart muscle. It's vital organs. It's brain mass. Okay. Yes. So no, we do not want people breaking down lean tissue. No. It is not acceptable to put someone on a low-calorie diet that doesn't meet their needs. Absolutely. And when they gain back the weight, which they will inevitably do, it does come back mainly as fat. which is what we've been trying to avoid with a diet. So, that's problematic.
Success. So, DeAun, how about looking a little bit at sort of what is the mainstream medical recommendation for improving health outcomes that we hear a lot is lose 5 to 10% of your body weight.
Right. Most studies recommend that for health changes and weight change.
Right. So that's interesting because let's just point out that if we are talking about achieving a 10% weight change, then how does that translate into how many pounds a person is losing? Well, if someone's 120 pounds, that would be losing 12 pounds. If someone is 200 pounds, then they are losing 20 pounds if they lose 10% of their weight.
When we think about that, a lot of that, it's a fairly small amount of weight, really. And for the most part, could even be considered within somebody's set point range, right? Because their set point range can be 10 to 20 pounds on either side. So if I'm 200 pounds and I lose 20 pounds, my body's going to be like, okay, whatever, we're at the low point of the set point, but I'm not starving, so I'm okay.
Right there. That's the key, okay, is that it's not black and white. A person could lose 12 pounds or 15 pounds or 10 pounds or 20 pounds, but we have to look beyond the number and look to, are they getting enough to eat? Mm-hmm. Was this a weight change that the body supported, that this is a well-fed body and we happen to have a weight fluctuation? Because you know what? Our bodies don't just stay the same at one number. Anybody can attest to this, that if you did weigh yourself every day, it's going to be real darn hard to keep that number in one spot.
Absolutely.
Our body weights fluctuate.
And even that 5-10% recommendation comes from the fact that in studies, we can't get people to generally keep more than that off. And so it went from, you need to lose 30% to 25% to 20%. Okay, well, maybe if you lose 5 to 10%, then that's enough. It might keep you on the low end of your own weight range, which is fine. I mean, that is fine. And for most people, if they're taking good care of their health and doing things that are healthy, they're exercising, eating well, all of the, sleeping, all of this stuff, they probably will stay on the lower end. And if they're not doing those things, they might creep up. So that might be a barometer for some people.
But let's just clearly state that a set point range is going to be different for each unique individual.
Yes.
So that we should never be assuming your weight should be here. We can't ever say that about anyone because we don't know. We don't know their history. We don't know their metabolic adaptations based on their dieting history or their access to food. And so it really actually doesn't support the notion at all that we really should even be focusing on weight in the first place, because we don't know how to predict where a person's weight should land that puts them in good health.
Right. Sumner, what about lifestyle changes? Right? That's the buzzword now. Diets are bad. We all know it, blah, blah, blah. But what about the lifestyle changes? We're going to do some lifestyle changes. We're going to cut out sugar. We're going to cut out gluten. And then we're going to lose weight, but doing it healthily, quote unquote healthily. And, because we're exercising and eating and all that, eating well, eating lots of fruits and vegetables and not having sugar and not having gluten and whatever,
not having all
whatever your
things.
whatever your choice for getting rid of a food is that day. What about that? That's not a diet, right?
No, it's not a diet. I mean, we can call it whatever you want. I'm kind of very sick of the term of lifestyle changes.
Me too.
But, what we are talking about is a difference between a focus on an outcome like weight loss versus what we know can help improve someone's health and well-being, which is changing behavior. Okay. And that also looks different for different people.
Absolutely.
Okay. We are not all one and the same. So different change, something that might make me feel good could be different from something that makes my neighbor feel good. Okay. Because we are different people. We have to understand that genetic factors and environmental factors are also going to play in to a person's overall health, that we do not have control over our health in the way that we all would like to believe we do.
Right. And we talked about this in a past episode when we talked about the myths around weight stigma and the assumption that we have a lot of control over our health. We don't. We have some, certainly, but it is not as much as we think it is.
So I think your question around, well, lifestyle changes, that's not a diet. Anything that feels restrictive to a person or is restrictive actually to the body is going to have negative diet consequences. I don't care what you're calling it. So we need to be very aware of that if, let's say, cutting out sugar completely from someone's diet, if that doesn't feel sustainable and satisfying and pleasurable to a person, the chances of that being a true lifestyle change is very, very low.
Right.
Not sustainable.
And it generally will lead to binging behaviors in whatever you've decided. So if you've decided to get rid of sugar, you very often will find yourself wanting to have sugar a lot. Some people kind of get over that, but really if they're given sugar, they still want it.
What we see is that those who restrict a particular food or a particular food group have then heightened cravings and desires for the very thing that they're restricting. It's incredibly predictable. Study after study after study will show that restriction leads to overcompensating and or binging.
Absolutely.
So then the other thing that we see as this really predictable outcome from dieting and restriction is a person's life pretty much goes out the window, and it doesn't take long for this to happen. So what I mean by that is that the preoccupation with dieting or calorie counting or cutting out certain foods, that takes up a lot of a person's brain energy really and time. And then, which in turn has this effect on other pieces of their life, such as they don't have the same energy available for their relationships, for things that are pleasurable, relaxation, learning, actual brain power. A hungry brain, if you think about it, you're not concentrating, you're not thinking clearly. And even like curiosity, about your life, your world around you, you're not able to focus. So of course there's this kind of range on how much you're restricted and how long you've been restricted. But these certainly are outcomes that set in.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, again, we are not saying don't make changes to your life or your behaviors that improve your well-being. What we're saying is let's pay close attention to this balance of including behaviors that feel good for you and that you perceive to be good for you without sacrificing these other things in your life. Because we know that these other things are really important for health and well-being.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of things that we can check on as physicians that are not related to weight. So, you're looking at someone's blood glucose, their hemoglobin A1C, their blood pressure, insulin levels, insulin sensitivity versus insulin resistance, their blood lipids. All of those things can be improved regardless of whether or not weight change happens. And for some people, when they make health improvements in their lives, they do have weight change. They might lose some weight. Some people gain weight because they've been artificially keeping their weight low and their body is trying to get back up to their set point. And some people don't really change weight that much at all. Their body composition might change some, but for the most part, they just kind of stay the same way they are. But we see all of those markers getting better. And in general, also, something I always like to point out is when we have liposuction done, those markers actually don't change. So it's not the fat that's the problem. And with weight loss surgery, very often those markers will change at least the blood glucose changes immediately prior to any weight loss at all. And there are a lot of thoughts as to why that happens, but it's definitely not related to just the weight loss. And I'm going to actually have a whole conversation about weight loss surgery in the future as well. I find it to be very problematic. With those two ideas, if the weight loss itself isn't making the changes, then why are we worrying about it?
Right.
Why is that an issue?
Right. And I think that often especially, of course, in the medical world, we look to evidence, right? We want to be following evidence-based recommendations. It's so important, and it's such a big part of this conversation that we're really discovering what are the best practices. And you will easily find studies out there that are showing a connection between obesity and health, and as well as certain diets and weight and health. However, we really need to acknowledge that in most cases, the studies done are short-lived with less than 2 years follow-up. They often have large attrition rates, and they make assumptions about what has contributed to a health improvement found during the study. It's not a causal relationship.
Absolutely. If somebody happens to lose weight during the study and they have a health improvement, it must be the weight loss. And that bias is there for most researchers. And if you're not thinking beyond that, if you're not wondering what other things could be causing this health improvement, then you're not going to really search anything out. Or if a negative thing happens and weight gain happens, then again, you're going to associate that with the weight gain. You're not going to associate it with the fact that people in larger bodies are stigmatized, or that they're not getting sufficient health care, right? Because their doctors aren't paying attention to what they need, or they don't want to go to the doctor. So these are concepts that we really need to remember.
And we know that health markers like hemoglobin A1C and blood pressure and insulin sensitivity and blood lipids can and do change in studies that are not weight biased.
Right.
And we have that information. And so we need to be following up with that. And since now it is very clear that a weight change or weight loss is, in the majority of cases, not sustainable, we need to start looking at, all right, well, what's all this evidence that's showing us that there is sustainable ways to change these health markers that have nothing to do with weight change?
So we're going to change topics just a little here. We wanted to talk about restriction and binge eating, which we alluded to earlier a little bit. In eating studies, where they have people come into a lab and they don't tell them they're doing an eating study. They usually have them come in and say, hey, we're going to have you eat these snacks to tell us, do they taste good? And it's some sort of a, what's the word? Marketing.
Like a focus
type.
group.
Yeah, a focus group. What they would do is they would give people milkshakes beforehand. So they would have something in their stomach already. And then they would have them, try these snacks. And what they found is that people who were controlled eaters, so people who had dieted, generally ate more snacks after they had the milkshake. And people who did not diet, or who were not controlled eaters, more intuitive eaters, tended to eat fewer snacks, which would make sense. If you've already had a milkshake, you might not be that hungry. The idea here was that the people who were very focused on external cues for eating kind of thought, oh, well, I've already had a milkshake. I can eat whatever I want now because I'll just do my diet later.
No diet today because we had a milkshake.
Exactly. Interestingly enough, if they were given a salad before the snacks that had the same number of calories as the milkshake, the controlled eaters would actually eat fewer snacks. So they would eat more along the lines of somebody who was full.
Because they didn't think they'd messed up, right?
Right. So they were still in control of their diet. Whereas the intuitive eaters in both situations tended to eat fewer snacks because they were full and they didn't need that many snacks.
This study is so clearly, just in a very simple way, shows you that diet cycle where I have intention to restrict, intention to control. The moment that stops happening, whether it's a choice I make or a binge or I eat a cookie or a milkshake, then I'm off the diet. And then we have to then at some point get back on the diet.
Right. And people think that willpower is the way to handle a lot of this. But we know from a lot of studies not related to dieting that willpower is a limited resource. So, if you're trying to use your willpower on anything else, or you get distracted, or you drink some alcohol, or you get tired, or really anything.
You're stressed and you have to cope somehow.
Exactly. Then willpower goes right out the window and you no longer can restrict So very often you do have, you have that cookie and then you're like, oh, I've had the cookie. I might as well eat all the cookies. And then you feel guilty.
And then remember
and then you start
that restrictor, that cookie tastes 5 times as good to that person who's been restricting versus somebody who could have a cookie all the time or every day and have it not be a big deal.
Absolutely. And something I heard Isabel Fox and Duke say at one point, that the only thing between a binge and not a binge is the guilt. As soon as you feel guilty about it, it is a binge. And I thought that was it's a little off topic, but it was very interesting.
Well, the dieting mind is incredibly loud and strong and negative and shaming.
And very perfectionistic. Mm-hmm. It's all or nothing. It's black or white.
Mm-hmm.
And that thinking leads us into weight cycling.
Yes, exactly. So weight cycling, this pattern of somebody losing weight and regaining and then losing again and regaining, it's a very real and a very predictable thing. So we can pretty much predict that someone who's dieting is going to lose weight and they're going to regain it back. And studies that assume dieting that leads to weight loss is a cause of health improvements. As we mentioned before, they're not looking long-term enough. They're not looking at, okay, what happens after the 2 years or after the diet ends? So if we as health professionals recommend a patient to go and try to lose weight when we know that the most likely outcome is short-term weight loss followed by weight regain, we are doing some harm there. Now, this diet cycling could be as short of a cycle as a 24-hour period where many, many people wake up in the morning, they don't eat very much throughout the first half of the day, and then second half of the day or later in the evening, they're binging and overeating. That's a 24-hour diet cycle.
Yeah. And super common.
Super common. And they think that, again, not to blame them. They don't think there's anything wrong with that. That's become, for many people, just their body's pattern because our bodies love patterns and they love to do the same thing every day. And there are truly effects on hunger and fullness. If you're overeating or eating larger quantities of food in the second half of the day, of course you're not that hungry in the morning.
Right.
So there's all kinds of things that are playing into this. So 24-hour diet cycle, or it could be someone who, is on a diet for 6 weeks or 8 months or 1 year or 2 years, but inevitably it ends. It ends for 9.5 out of 10 people. So we're talking about a predictable and in most cases inevitable occurrence that we hear about over and over. We see it in our patients over and over. And it's not their fault. It's reinforced by the diet industry. Unfortunately, it's really reinforced by our the way that we communicate about medicine and about health. And we can change this story. We can change this recommendation by changing the conversation about health away from weight change. We are also going to alleviate the shame and the stigma and the guilt and the future weight cycling that these patients are going to be going through.
Absolutely. And really, in the end, I think the best way to support people's health is to, as a society, reduce the shame and the stigma around having a larger body. Because it definitely affects even people who have smaller bodies, just in case they end up in a larger body. It's not just about what we're eating. It's not just about how much we're exercising or even all the healthy behaviors that we can do. Because that even if you have somebody in a larger body who is doing all of those healthy things, they're still going to be in a disadvantage to someone who's in a smaller body because of the society we live in. I think that's really important to keep in mind.
Absolutely. And then there are those of you listening who, of course, will acknowledge there's always going to be an exception to the rule, right? We're talking about the majority here.
Absolutely.
We know you've heard success stories of people who lost, large amounts of weight and kept it off for 20 years. And we're not negating those people's experiences or saying that they're lying or not telling the truth. We just want to highlight that for the purposes of discovering best practices, that the evidence supports most people will not maintain a body weight lower than their unique set point range without restricting or excessive exercise or deprivation or disordered eating.
Something I think about a lot is Oprah Winfrey. Oprah Winfrey is probably one of the most influential women in the world. And certainly, I think is she the wealthiest woman in the world too?
She's darn close.
So she's got a lot of resources and a lot of support, and she still cannot lose and keep off a significant amount of weight. And the fact that she even feels that she needs to is problematic in and of itself. That she is so successful and still feels like that is something that she needs to do just really says so much about our society. That she's not completely successful because she's not a size 2 or whatever size she wants to be. Yeah. You know, and I look at her and I see somebody who is active and, you know, does really well for her health. I don't know anything about her health. I'm not her doctor. But, you know, she's doing things that she always looks like she's trying to work for health. And so, man, if Oprah can't do it, I'm sorry. Like the rest of us are kind of screwed unless we get the genetic lottery.
We don't override our body's natural ability to control our body weight, in the exception of eating disorders. And that's not health. Mm-mm. Eating disorder behavior is not health. And we really need to start breaking away from a culture that's disordered into a culture that can support and help people with their health and well-being.
I really want to thank Sumner for joining me today. I was so excited to have somebody else to talk to instead of having you guys just listen to me babble. Where can we find some information about you?
Sure. You can go to edrdpro.com, and that stands for Eating Disorder Registered Dietitians and Professionals.
The theme music you're hearing was composed and provided by Galen Davis.